Hey everyone, we're going to spend 2 weeks on Immanuel Kant and the Ethics of Duty, and it's one of the most difficult thinkers you'll probably ever encounter in a class like ethics. But we're going to take our time, where we're going to work through only about 4 pages of his reading, and hopefully these videos will be of some help to you in understanding what's going on with him. And we'll work through some of the text pretty carefully too. All right, so let's take a look at some of the main takeaways from Kant. So really, I want you guys to be able to do 3 things with Kant. I want you to understand the difference between liberty and autonomy, because both liberty and autonomy often are used as synonyms for freedom. And we've understood the concept of liberty from Mill and the right to do whatever you want unless it harms others. And autonomy is going to be different. The other big notion in Kant is the idea of rights. And so we got to figure out what a right means for Kant and where rights come from. You can't just insist someone or something has a right just because you want them to. And so when we think about rights, there actually has to be some way to ground that, right? That's what we'll be working on. And then one of the things we're doing in the semester is we're looking at principles. And what I mean by principles are the part of ethics that we use to apply to our thinking about cases, right? So we have the principle of utility, right? Always try to choose the option that creates the most net happiness to all involved. That's a principle. The harm principle, right? That we can only interfere with people if their actions threaten to harm others. That's a principle. Kant's principle is going to be something called the Categorical Imperative, and it's a fancy phrase that just means a command that commands always. That's, I don't know if you've ever watched the news, a politician gets caught doing something and the politician says, "I categorically deny these accusations." That means I deny the accusations across the board completely. It's the opposite of hypothetical or conditional, right? So a categorical imperative is an absolute obligation, a command that is binding, that commands all the time. And he's going to have a couple of ways of articulating this command. And so we want to kind of understand that and understand what it would lead to in terms of our actual obligations. So that's the 3 main things. I want you to keep those in mind as we work on the reading together, as you watch the Sandel video, and as I sort of guide you through this a little bit. So the first issue is autonomy versus liberty. And the number one thing I want to say is that the Sandel video is going to be really helpful here. So really important that you watch the Sandel video. You've got some homework associated with that. It's pretty short homework. But Sandel is going to get into the question of what Kant means by autonomy. And I don't want to take away the fun, so I won't talk about it now, but I will go back and help with it next week a little bit. But very important to understand that for Kant, autonomy is a very particular notion of freedom. And it doesn't mean freedom to act on our desires. So the first thing I want you to think about is like, well, why not? Like if I want a cheeseburger and then I can go get the cheeseburger, that seems like I was free to get the cheeseburger. So it raises the question like, well, what could freedom mean if we define it Kant's way? So think about that. So remember, liberty suggests we should be free to do whatever we want if it doesn't harm others. Well, autonomy is going to be different. And this is what's interesting. Right? Autonomy means that our freedom is actually more limited than that. There are certain things we can't do even to ourselves. Now, this is important. This is not talking about the issue of government intervention. This is just sort of morally speaking. Kant would say certain things are always morally wrong. And remember, Mill is sort of not talking about that. So it's not like Mill would agree or disagree. It's kind of like they're talking past each other, right? Mill and On Liberty is talking about government intervention, not whether these things are right or wrong. But we could sort of use Mill and Kant here as a way of contrasting them with each other when we think about these examples. So there's a story that Sandel uses in a book. I can't remember if it's in the video, but those videos are based on a book called Justice, what's the right thing to do, which I recommend. It's a pretty approachable text in ethics. And he brings up this issue of a man in India who puts his first son through college by selling a kidney. And then his second son is ready to go to college, so he sells his second kidney. Now, you can sell one kidney and not die. You cannot sell both kidneys and not die. So the person is bringing about his death by, in order to pay for his kid's college. So a utilitarian might say, like, well, it's up to him to make the decision about which of those is the greater harm. There's another story. This is actually true. It's a story from Germany. This guy put an ad in the paper that he was looking to cannibalize somebody, and someone else responded like, hey, that's awesome because I'm looking to be cannibalized. So these are free and consenting adults. So if you think about it that way, one way of understanding that is there's sort of no harm done because it's free and consensual, and obviously between adults. But so Mill might say, like, yeah, that's okay. But Kant would basically say about both the kidney and the cannibalization, well, the problem with this is you are the kind of being that can't be thrown away, and you can't even throw yourself away. So it's morally wrong to bring about your death by selling your second kidney or by being cannibalized. Doesn't matter if it's something you choose to do. So it's an interesting question, right? So some people would totally disagree with him. Some people would say, like, of course, that makes sense. So something for you guys to think about. So the next topic is, what is a right? So utilitarians talk about rights, but I think for a utilitarian, what a right is just like something we take really seriously. So if I have a right to my property, that means that, like, that's a really strong interest in keeping my property. But for utilitarianism, there will always, at least possibly, be some condition under which I could take away your property. Remember, Mill says, right, I'm not going to appeal to the notion of right in the abstract sense. So what he means is, like, for Mill, rights are just based on, society is better off in the long run if we do this rather than that. But because they can be violated, they're not inalienable. Okay, well, being inalienable means a right can't be taken away. And for Kant, rights are inalienable, right? So I can't, maybe you're a horrible, horrible person. That doesn't mean I can abuse you or torture you or whatever. It also doesn't mean that I can sort of take your right away because I can bring about some greater good. So if I could cure COVID or cancer or something like that by experimenting on the homeless against their will, I would never, right, that's completely off limits. You would never be able to do that, right? Because those rights to certain humane treatment are inalienable for Kant. So some people think this is the greatest weakness of Kant, that, like, okay, but you can prevent a bomb from killing 1,000 people by torturing one person. If you don't do that, that's crazy. If you think all the way back to Singer's like, it's crazy not to kill the one innocent person to save the lives of the other four if there's no other option. And Kant would be like, no, you can't do that ever. And so some people are like, well, that's insane. Singer would say that's insane. Here's an interesting story, though, real quick, to get you thinking about it. True story. And it involves how brilliant I am, so that's always nice. I was at a conference, and this guy tells the following story, that in the outback of Australia, this woman goes into a store and leaves her child in the back of the car while she goes into the store real quick. It's a very, very hot day, kind of in the middle of nowhere, and when she comes out, the car is gone. It's been stolen. The guy who steals the car does not realize there's a kid in the back of the car, did not mean to kidnap this child. It freaks out, abandons the car with the kid still in it, takes a bunch of stuff from the car, and flees. Guy is picked up later by the police, and it is quite clear that he has stolen this car because of the things he has on his person. They ask him to tell them where the car is. They're like, look, we just want to save the kid. And he's like, if I confess, I'm going to go down as kid for kidnapping. This is crazy. I'm not going to say anything. So they beat the hell out of him, and he winds up telling them, and they go and they find the kid and they save the kid. And the guy at the conference was saying this is an example of why torture is sometimes totally okay. And I asked the following question because I'm a genius. I said, well, what if everything in the story is the same, except there's not enough air in the car and the kid is dead when they get there? And the guy said, well, then it's different. So this is an interesting issue when it comes to Kant versus utilitarianism, because it raises the question of how could it be the case that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on something entirely beyond our control, like how much air is in the car. So how could consequences possibly determine the rightness or wrongness of actions, because we don't control consequences? So it's something to think about as a defense of why we might prefer Kant's approach. Okay, I got to pick up the pace here. So why do we get inalienable rights? Well, inalienable rights, remember, are boundaries we can't cross. And Kant's going to say we're ends in themselves, ends in ourselves. So we have dignity and deserve respect. And we have dignity and deserve respect and have rights because we have autonomy. And again, you got to look at the Sandel reading, and I want you to really look at the Kant reading from the whole lens of how does this all connect to the idea that human beings or persons have autonomy. But the key word I want you to remember is for Kant, it all comes back to autonomy. If humans are capable of autonomy, then they have dignity, are worthy of respect, and they have rights, and therefore we have certain obligations, period. A lot of what he's doing in his the writing is just trying to defend the idea that in fact we're capable of autonomy. So there's pros and cons of this, right? On the plus side, that means certain things are off limits. And it also means there are duties to treat people a certain way. And by duty, we mean absolute obligation. By the way, that's important. It doesn't just mean a duty is your job. It doesn't mean a duty is the right thing to do. Duty means something very specific for Kant. It means an absolute obligation. So imagine that there is a right to clean air and water. Presumably this right would follow from the right to the means necessary to survival. And so if we have a right to the means necessary to survival, then someone or something has an obligation to provide that to us. And so when we think about sustainability and we think on the governmental level, we might think about government and corporations having maybe an absolute responsibility to ensure clean air and water, for example. On the minus side, though, Kant links autonomy to rights, and autonomy is connected to the idea of being a person. So a pig does not have rights, a tree does not have rights, and it seems like it's a little hard to figure out why Kant would think we have any obligations. In fact, Kant troublingly says that the reason not to torture animals is because you'll probably be a serial killer, not because animals have value unto themselves. So very big, huge weakness in Kant. So the last thing I want you to think about is using this principle, the categorical imperative. Now the wording here is super confusing. Always act so that you could will that the maximum of your action could simultaneously serve as a universal law. But it's actually not as hard as it looks. A maxim is just a principle or a way of thinking. So another way of saying this is something is wrong if you wouldn't want it to be the case that everyone did the same thing for the same reasoning. So why can't I just take Nick's got an iPod. I love the iPod example because it's so outdated. Someone else needs an iPod. Nick has 20 of them. And so I just take it and Nick doesn't even notice. Why can't I do that? Well, if everybody could take somebody's possessions or property and give it to someone else who needs it more, right? Would we want to live in a world where nothing is actually yours? Or if I get you to do something by lying to you, would I want it to be the case that everybody lied in order to get what they wanted? And the idea is, of course not. That principle is supposed to be give the same results as this one. Always treat humanity, whether in one's own person or that of another, as an end in itself and never as a means only. In other words, you can't treat people as objects or tools, even for good reasons. And that's not just don't use people, because it doesn't have to be for selfish reasons. It could be for even good reasons.